welcome to the Alpine Valley School podcast. This is your host, Missa Gallivan. Today's episode is all about belonging. What does it mean, as a child, to have a place where you really belong, where you are accepted for your authentic self? For many, the experience of real belonging only happens when the labels and barriers of traditional schooling are stripped away. No longer are students defined by a grade level or a learning disability. At Alpine Valley School, you are just Josh, or Gina, or Missa. You are defined by your choices rather than your labels. To begin today's episode, I'd like to take a deeper look at what it means to belong, especially compared to the concept of fitting in, something we are typically encouraged to do as children. In my opinion, no one has better defined the difference between fitting in and belonging than Dr. Brené Brown, a researcher, author, and speaker who has written several books on the subject of vulnerability and authenticity. I'm going to read a fairly long, but very valuable, quote from an article she posted on Oprah.com. I'll link to the article in the show notes. This is what Dr. Brown has to say. There are so many terms we use every day whose meanings are gauzy, if not downright imprecise, which makes it hard to get your head around what's really going on in your life. For example, contrary to what most of us think, belonging is not fitting in. In fact, fitting in is the greatest barrier to belonging. Fitting in, I've discovered during the past decade of research, is assessing situations and groups of people, then twisting yourself into a human pretzel in order to get them to let you hang out with them. Belonging is something else entirely. It's showing up and letting yourself be seen and known as you really are. Love of gourd painting, intense fear of public speaking, and all. Many of us suffer from this split between who we are and who we present to the world in order to be accepted. But we're not letting ourselves be known, and this kind of incongruent living is soul-sucking. In my research, I've interviewed a lot of people who never fit in, who are what you might call different. Scientists, artists, thinkers. And if you drop down deep into their work and who they are, there is a tremendous amount of self-acceptance. Some of them have to scrap for it, like the rest of us. But most are like this neurophysicist I met who essentially told me, my parents didn't care that I wasn't on the football team, and my parents didn't care that I was awkward and geeky. I was in a group of kids at school who translated books into Klingon, and my parents were like, awesome! They took me to Star Trek conventions. He got his sense of belonging from his parents' sense of belonging. And even if we don't get that from mom and dad, we have to create it for ourselves, or we will always feel as if we're standing outside the big human party. The truth is, belonging starts with self-acceptance. Your level of belonging, in fact, can never be greater than your level of self-acceptance. Because believing that you are enough is what gives you the courage to be authentic, vulnerable, and imperfect. When we don't have that, we shapeshift and turn into chameleons. We hustle for the worthiness we already possess. What Dr. Brown hits on in her article is exactly what I've seen at Alpine Valley School, time and again, self-acceptance. And sometimes that starts from the outside, with a new student enrolling in a school, and a group of people who say, we see you, we care about you, and you belong here. There can be no underestimating the power of that statement. My guest today has experienced the real impact of belonging for herself as a student at Alpine Valley School. Vanessa Reich-Shackelford enrolled at AVS in 2000, fresh out of her first year of public high school, and graduated with an AVS diploma in 2004. As you'll hear, she put those 4 short years to great use and found a measure of all-important self-acceptance along the way. Here's our conversation. Hello, it's nice to talk to you.
Hi, Missa. It's really nice to talk to you too.
So let's jump right in here.
Okay.
Now, I know you as Vivi, but I think you go by Vanessa these days, so you'll have to forgive me if I slip up.
No worries at all.
I would love if you would give our listeners just a little information on kind of your history with Alpine Valley School.
definitely. So, trying to think where I should start. I actually went to a lot of different types of schools ever since I was young. I went to a few Montessori schools, or at least a couple. I went to traditional, public school. I went to a public school in the mountains of Colorado where I mostly grew up, a little 2-room schoolhouse. And I went to a Seventh-day Adventist school for a bit. So my parents were really like searching for something that was going to work for me. And it was hard, and to be completely honest. And I ended up at a public high school for maybe a semester and a half or so. And I, by that time, was kind of done with traditional schooling. And I had a really hard time. It was very, very hard for me to understand a lot of things that were being presented in class. For example, math class was very, very hard. And that's also kind of when I discovered that maybe at the time I didn't realize it, but now I realize, looking back, that I was starting to see the anxiety that I've dealt with for now many years. And I remember, doing homework and having a very, very hard time, being very, very frustrated because I didn't understand it. And I didn't feel like I had a lot of resources available to me to understand things. And my parents just kind of went, okay, this is not working. And my dad had known about Sudbury Valley in Massachusetts for years. I don't remember how he heard about it, but he'd known about it for a long time. And my mom had to warm up to the idea, but eventually they were like, okay, there's a school like this in Denver, and we are definitely going to check this out. So I was actually listening to the interview with Aaron Kerr, and he was talking about how he read Free at Last. I devoured Free at Last. I read that book like 3 times, cover to cover. I was so excited to get out of this sort of endless loop of a system that was not working for me. And when we figured out that I was actually going to go, I did my visiting week and at ABS, and we knew that it was the right place for me. I was just so excited. So that's kind of a long answer to your question, but it was like this long, year-long process of me, struggling. And then years-long process of me struggling. And then finally it just all came together. So yeah.
That's wonderful. Do you remember how you knew, or how at least you and your parents knew that AVS was the right place? Was there like a moment when it all coalesced?
I remember my first day. This was at our old building when we were renting from a church. And I remember it was a pretty small space. And I remember my first day being a little bit awkward. Or like not my first day, maybe my first hour. Everybody had, a bunch of people had come up to me and said, hi, we're so glad you're here. Great to meet you. And I guess I was kind of pulled into an activity right away. And for me, that was awkward because I wasn't used to that. But that was just how things were at ABS. And then I guess by the end of the day, I had made a bunch of new friends. They were instantly my friends. And something about that was oh, wait, this is a community where I'd actually be wanted. And because I was struggling a lot socially in my public high school as well. And I think that kind of I went home and I remember saying to my mom, this is so different and this is awesome.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I kind of had a very similar feeling where it was just I walked in, and that first day people were I don't know, trying to get donations for the kitchen, I think. And we're just,
oh, yeah.
I walked right in and they were like, hey, help us call all these businesses and get donations of pots and pans. And I was like, okay. So I think it was sounds like a similar experience that.
Yeah, you're just really thrown into it.
Yeah. And it's a good feeling.
Yeah. For me, it was awkward because, to be completely honest, because I wasn't used to it. But I got used to it. And by the end of my visiting week, I was like, this is where I want to be. This is my place. And then I remember there was a little bit of time before I actually started, I think maybe a couple weeks. My parents literally pulled me out of school because they were like, she's just done. And I was. And that was the time when I was like reading free at last. And I was just so excited to go to AVS.
Yeah. So you were like prepping for coming to AVS.
Pretty much.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
It was great.
Did that feeling of belonging last while you were here?
Yes. Oh my goodness. AVS was my home away from home. Not to get into too much detail, but my home life was not ideal at the time. And AVS was the place I could go to that was a home. And the stuff that was going on at my actual home did bleed a little bit into my experience at AVS just because I was always dealing with it. But it was also a refuge. So.
Sure. I think I mentioned in the interview with Josh when I used to go off campus that I would say that AVS was home, right? That you were we were going home. We'd go off campus to McDonald's or something, and then we'd say, okay, it's time to go home. And we weren't talking about our house. We were talking about the school.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a feeling that a lot of kids have. I hear that even with some of the younger ones we have now, that they're like, okay, it's time to go home. And they mean going back to school.
That's so funny. I don't know if I actually had that word for it. I don't remember, but I remember just, I probably said, let's go back to campus or something, but yeah.
But the feeling was there.
Yes, absolutely.
So how do you remember spending your time as a student at AVS?
I was thinking about that recently, and the wonderful thing about AVS for me was I was able to do so many things, and like the whole world was open to me, which was amazing. And I would I feel like every day was a little bit different. It was hard to get into the non-structure, but eventually I guess it wasn't that hard. It probably didn't take too long, but when I did kind of get into it and kind of get comfortable with it, I just thrived. One day I'd be doing my Japanese homework because we had a Japanese class, which I think you actually started.
Yeah, I think it might have been me and Bronwyn.
Yeah, I think so. So I do Japanese homework for a bit, and then I would work on a story that I was writing. I did so much writing while I was there. I got really into photography, so I would just like walk around the school taking pictures of people and things. We had a dark room for a little while. I'd spent some time in there. Towards my later years, I sort of rediscovered dance, which was something that I had done when I was younger, and would do that for exercise. It's like I feel like not every day was exactly the same, which is wonderful.
Which is interesting because we get that question all the time of what's a typical day, that you're trying to define. It's mostly parents that ask, trying to say like, what can I expect that my child's going to be doing every day? And we're like, we don't know.
Yeah.
Like exactly. Whatever they want to, I guess. So I asked if you were to be asked that question, like what was a typical day like for you? Is your answer just basically that there wasn't one?
Yeah, I would say there wasn't a typical day, but there was always a full day.
That's a great answer.
Because there was always stuff going on. And, one of the sort of things that you have to figure out when you're a student there is you're going to get bored. And what are you going to do with that boredom? And I think that the boredom actually launches you into some really exciting and new things. Or you pick up a book or something. And so you're constantly learning, like every second of the day. You're learning. And that's the same outside of AVS too. That was something that AVS or Sudbury schools really spoke to me. It's like, yeah, of course you're learning all the time, no matter what you're doing.
It's part of being human.
Yeah.
Ideally, anyway.
Yeah.
So as a teenager, when you started, what was it like for you being around little kids?
I don't remember it ever being a problem or being awkward. In fact, I think when I very first started at AVS, they were the ones that I somehow were the most comfortable with. because I feel like maybe I was trying to put up a front a little bit for the older kids, which eventually totally went away. But with the little kids, like I think it was Crystal, if you remember Crystal, ran up to me and was like the first person to talk to me when I first walked in the door. And so I actually ended up being quite close with Crystal until she didn't stay at the school anymore, until she left. And she was, I don't know how many years younger than me, at least 5. So it was very, it was easy being around the kids. Like they just sort of teach you that you don't have to be like, on guard all the time, or putting up some sort of, front all the time. Like they're just naturally curious and fun, and they play, and like that was something that I really embraced, was being around the kids.
And it didn't ever feel like you were having to take care of them, or you were like a babysitter kind of situation?
Only if they came up to me and asked me for help or something. Which happens sometimes, but it was normally like, hey, I'm doing this art project and I'm trying to like put a mask on the back of my head or whatever. Can you help me buy it? It was like, it was random stuff like that. I don't think that I cared for the kids, but I wouldn't say that I was like a babysitter. No.
Yeah. But it felt like a benefit then, it sounds like.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Being around kids was so cool.
That's great. And you talked just a little bit about what it was like for you, at least at first, relating with kids your own age, but can you say a little bit more about that? Like your relations with kids that would have maybe been closer to your own grade if you were in a traditional school?
Yeah, and I really don't know why it was a little bit harder to get into that. But when I think about it, I think I might be blowing it a little bit out of proportion. I think it was by the end of the by the end of the visiting week, I was comfortable with like pretty much everybody. But the first few days, I think I was just kind of coming out of this public school, traditional school mindset where you're kind of always, maybe not everybody's like this in public school. I shouldn't say that everybody is, but you're kind of playing a part, and you move into an environment where suddenly you don't have to do that. You can be yourself. You can be authentic. You can be vulnerable too, not in a bad way. You can explore parts of yourself that you weren't able to explore in a traditional school. And so being around the kids that were my same age, at first I was kind of like, how do I relate to these people? They're different than the people that I knew in public school. Granted, like I had great friends in public school. I keep in touch with some of them, a lot of them actually still. But there was something about, it's so hard to put my finger on it, but there was something about the way that the kids at AVS who were around my age, they were just so confident. They were so willing to just, they were up for anything. They didn't belittle each other. They didn't, what am I trying to say? They didn't make fun of each other even. And if they did, it was all in good fun. And also, I think that, now knowing how the JC, the Judicial Committee program works, or like, how it works, they knew that if there ever was a problem, just in the back of their heads, they knew that if there ever was a problem, they would be able to take care of it in some sort of way, in some sort of systematic way through JC, and that they were going to be treated fairly in that process. I think you just kind of know that in the back of your mind all the time when you're at AVS. And that was a little hard for me to relate to at first because, I came from a different environment. And but eventually you're just immersed in it, and eventually you just get used to it.
Sure. And to me, what that all sounds like is safety, right? That there's a sense of safety that allows you to open up.
Yes, that's a very good word for it. Yeah.
So you talked a little bit, you mentioned Judicial Committee. I'm curious what your experience was in Judicial Committee as a student.
JC was like an integral pillar of AVS. And I was judicial clerk, I think, for 2 years in a row. And I actually loved it. It just, I had experiences in public school where it was like, oh, you might have done something wrong. We're going to go see the principal. And then the principal lectures you. But what do you really learn from that?
Mm-hmm. Not to like the principal.
Sorry?
So usually you learn that you don't like the principal.
Yeah, exactly. And I didn't like the principal at my last school before AVS. And judicial committee makes you really think about what's going on, what your actions were. Um, you end up having a sentence, and that makes you really reflect on, like, usually the sentence has something to do with whatever case is being brought into to the JC. So um, you're doing that sentence and you're kind of thinking about the situation that brought you to JC. And yeah, you process it through that in a very different way than sitting in front of a principal being lectured at. Um, I don't know why I was JC clerk for 2 years. There's something about it though that um, I think I just like, I would see kids change in front of my very eyes in really positive ways. It was very cool to be part of.
Yeah, that's great. It's a good system, I think.
I think so too.
So you graduated in 2004, right?
Yes.
What do you remember about the graduation process?
It was a little bit, I don't want to say stressful, but it was involved. I had to write a thesis. And, my only regret of being at AVS, or while being at AVS, was that I didn't do something a little more interesting for my thesis presentation. I basically stood up there and said the different points of my thesis. And
which many people do. That's pretty traditional, I would say.
Totally, but being a really creative person and seeing what some people did after me, I was like, I should have done something more interesting, but it's fine. It was a little nerve-wracking being up there and presenting to everybody, even though I have a background in acting and being on stage and public speaking. I still was, it meant a lot to me, so I was a little bit nervous.
You're talking about the public portion, right, where the thesis defense itself.
Exactly. And so it was a little nerve-wracking, but I feel like it's a little bit of a blur. It went well. They did their vote right after, and it was unanimous that I would get my diploma. But the process itself is like, just takes so much reflection. I remember going to quiet corners of the school or going off campus or even just out into the yard with a notebook and just writing down my, just reflecting on myself. So that was actually tough. It's hard to sometimes look at yourself and see the good and see the bad,
Especially when you're that age and you were what, 18, 19 when you graduated?
I was 19, and it's so funny because I felt like I was so old because I was like, I'm the oldest kid at school. But now I'm like, I was young. I was a kid.
Yeah. That's pretty young to look at everything about your life too and really have to account for how you've spent your time.
Yeah. But it was overall a positive experience because I actually realized through that I had done a lot more cool stuff than not. And that I had made I'd had lots of growth. So.
Good.
Yeah.
Speaking of growth, I want to change gears a little bit and just have you tell me something about what you're doing now with your life.
Yeah, definitely. It's been a winding road. So I'm living in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada right now. I went to university after, how many years? Maybe it was 2 years after I graduated. I ended up going to university in New Brunswick, which is on the east coast of Canada, which is a whole other story, but it was a great experience. I loved it. And I decided I wanted to stay in Canada. And Canada has really become my home. I've been here 10, 11 years, which is crazy to think about. So I'm actually now working on my second degree in communication at a university called Simon Fraser University here in the Vancouver area. It's actually a very well-known school in Canada, and it's a good school. And I'm also working on campus. I'm working in a nonprofit organization. Basically, our mandate is that we support women in the STEM field, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics, We support them with resources and events and networking opportunities, but we also try to spread awareness of the fact that there are not enough women in the STEM fields and that there need to be more. So we look at what you can do for kids who are in school, elementary school to high school. We look at what can be done in universities and what can be done beyond the program. I really enjoy working there, and I'm basically assisting my supervisor with all sorts of fun projects. And then I'm also producing my own podcast, which is a hobby podcast, but it's on the X-Files. And I've been doing that for 2 years, and I've learned so much about it. And I've actually decided when my contract is up with this job that I'm doing now, I'm going to be starting my own business, or at least a couple businesses, doing basically communications for different sectors. And one thing that I want to do is offer podcasting support and consult people on how to start podcasts and how they can use them as a part of their marketing strategy, actually. So I've got a lot of little things going on right now and things that I'm planning, and I actually have been thinking about it. And one thing that AVS taught me was that I can be okay with the fact that I have 8 million interests and, and I can harness them and I can do things with them that are productive. And I mean, maybe not every single interest that I have, but I can focus down to a few of them, and that's okay, especially in this 2017 world where we're all connected on the internet, and there's just so much possibility. So
yeah, one of the things I think too is it helps you let go of interests too when they're faded.
Yeah, that's true. It's like, okay, well, that isn't a thing I'm really doing anymore, and that's totally fine.
Right. And it doesn't feel like, oh, I'm so attached to this. This is my identity. I can't not do this anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Wonderful. It sounds like you're really involved with a worthy cause.
I hope so. Yeah, the organization I'm working with is really awesome. My supervisor is really awesome. We're doing very cool projects. We have so many projects. Actually, if people want to check it out, or maybe you could put the website in the show notes or something. But,
yeah, for sure.
There's lots of stuff on there, and there's blog posts on there that I've written as well. So
great. And what's the name of the organization?
It's called West Coast Women in Engineering, Science, and Technology. We call it WEST, WWEST. That's the abbreviation for it.
Great. Yeah, and I'll definitely put some information in the show notes.
Great.
So when you meet people who ask about your schooling, how do you describe AVS to them? How do you talk about that a part of your life?
Sometimes I don't want to say I make fun of it, but I kind of will joke and I'll be like, oh, my, crazy alternative school. Because a lot of people that I meet, there have been a few Sudbury schools in Canada, but I think most of them have shut down. And there's one in Toronto right now that's kind of trying to gain traction. And there's one here in BC, but it's not really a Sudbury school. And so it's a pretty foreign concept to a lot of people here. And in general, I guess, maybe in the US it is too. But here, Canadians seem to be very happy with the education system itself, but not with the government. At least in BC, the government has done a lot of things to underfund the education system, which is really unfortunate. I'm actually a believer that the Sudbury Valley model might not work for every single person, and that's fine. But I think it works for most kids for sure. But anyway, so when I talk about AVS, it's a pretty foreign concept to people. And so I usually say I went to a school that was democratically run, where all the students and staff had a vote and nothing was decided without a democratic process. And then people usually ask, yeah. And then people usually ask questions, and then we talk a little bit more about it if we have time.
Yep. That's almost exactly what I say too. And then you just I usually just drop a little bit. And then if they don't ask any questions, then I'm like, great, let's move on.
Yeah.
But exactly. If they do, then you're like, okay, here we go.
I've had a couple people be like, oh, that makes sense, because they realize that I'm the person who's like really believes in a democratic process, and I'm the person, like, if they know me well, and I'm the person who has all these passions and interests, and they're like, oh, so you were given the freedom to explore the things you wanted to explore. That makes so much sense. It's pretty funny.
That is. So I've got two more questions here. So the first one is, what advice would you give to parents who are just starting out with the model, whose kids are just enrolled? Do you have anything that you would share with people who are like still kind of worried about it and not sure how this is going to turn out?
Trying to think what my parents struggled with. My parents had given me a lot of independence anyway, but I think they sometimes struggled with being hands off. But that's kind of essential to how AVS functions, is you have to just sort of trust that your child is going to be okay. And that is scary, I'm sure, as a parent, but it's so important. You can be interested in what your child is doing at school. You can ask them questions about it later. But if you try to say, okay, well, I'm worried you're not doing enough math, for example, that's probably not going to get you very far. I think that I don't know the best way to do this, but if you can step back and you can just observe your child and how they blossom, and just trust that they're being taken care of and that they are able to take care of themselves, you're going to be a lot happier.
I think, and so is your child.
What's that?
I said, and so is your child. You'll both be happier.
Definitely. I don't know the best way to do that, but I think that as far as I remember, like, the staff members were pretty available to talk to parents if they had concerns too.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, and there are resources out there. There are books, and the AVS. There's a blog now. We didn't have that when I was going there, and I remember my parents coming in and sometimes just talking to the staff members and getting a lot of knowledge and advice from them. So there are places you can turn to if you are worried about things. But I think that the trust issue is just such a big one.
Yep, it's pretty central.
Mm-hmm.
So my last question is about your favorite memory of AVS, if you have one.
Yeah, you actually asked me that before. You were like, here's a question I'm going to ask.
Right, because I feel bad springing at people, and I've done that a couple of times.
No, it's okay. I'm glad that you prepared me. The thing is, though, I don't have a single individual memory. I mean, the memories that I have of AVS are being there, the everyday, sitting in the main room and having activity around me or not having activity around me, because sometimes it was actually quiet in there. I remember being in JC. I remember being in school meeting. I was school meeting chair for at least 1 year, maybe two. I don't really remember. And I remember just being in that environment. I remember this, it just felt like the school always had this like buzz, and it was just, there was this energy always happening there. Just this creativity and this vibe that's really hard to explain in words. And I remember going off campus and playing volleyball at one of the parks nearby. I remember doing improv with you and a few of our friends and the kids sitting in the audience and just laughing and laughing and laughing and having so much fun if we were like playing a game and we were like, okay, we need a profession. And then they'd all like scream out something different and, we'd have to go with one of them. And gosh, I just remember the everyday stuff. And I have to admit that I sometimes really miss it. Like, there's really nothing else out there like AVS. And once in a while, I get it when I am like with some good friends and we're playing board games or something. And we're all just relaxed and having fun and supporting each other. And then I'm like, oh yeah, this is what I felt like to be at AVS, And yeah, I wish it hadn't gone by so fast for me. 4 years wasn't super long.
No, it doesn't feel long even when you're there for longer.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true.
So I'm going to share my favorite memory of you and I.
Oh, yay.
Well, at least one of them. I mean, I have many, but
Me too.
we did that play where I was a spider and you were a bee.
Yes.
And we built this giant spider web in the back of the theater, or the back of the stage, that is. And we did such a good job that when we did the actual performance, at the end I'm supposed to like fly into the web and get stuck. And I got legitimately stuck. I could not get out.
I remember that. That's what I thought you were
so great. Yeah, you were so great in that play because you were like singing and you had all this like silly stuff to do. And I just think about that every now and then. And I remember how panicked I was that we were doing our curtain call and I couldn't get out of that stupid web.
I remember that too. Yeah, I had actually forgotten about that. That play was fun.
It was fun. That was a good one.
I still have pictures of me wearing the bee costume.
You were a fine bee.
You were a fine spider.
Thank you.
Yes.
And thank you for coming on the show today.
You're so welcome.
I so appreciate everything you had to say. And I think it sounds like kind of the theme that came out was about belonging. Would you say that that's true?
I think that's a big theme for sure. Yeah. I know that you already did an episode on community, but I think that ties into community too, is this feeling of being part of a community and belonging in one and unconditionally belonging there, Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I appreciate you sharing your story and your perspective, and thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you, Missa.
Thanks to Vanessa for sharing her story with us today. I do want to make a couple of notes. One is that Vanessa mentions visiting weeks a couple of times in her interview, which is actually something that we no longer do. We've learned over the years that the best approach for new students is just to dive right in and be a full part of the community. So we conduct an admissions interview, and if all goes well, typically enroll the new student right away. I just wanted to mention that in case there's any confusion. Second, as I said in the interview, I'll include a link to the organization Vanessa works for in the show notes, along with a link to the book Free at Last, which, as you have heard if you're a follower of the show, was very influential for a number of families. Vanessa also mentioned the Alpine Valley School blog, which, as I've mentioned before, we have actually consolidated into a free ebook on our website. If you want to get your own copy, just head over to alpinevalleyschool.com, click on the About Us page, and you'll see an advertisement for the ebook near the bottom of the page. That does it for our show today. Thanks to Vanessa Reich-Shackelford for being my guest today, and as always to Isaac Eliason, who composed all the music for the show. By the way, and I can't believe I didn't mention this earlier, Isaac is also an AVS graduate. I'm Missa Gallivan. This is the Alpine Valley School podcast, and we'll be back again in 2 weeks with more stories of real learning for real life.